Welcome to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast, where we explore the spirituality of the Christian child using the method of catechesis of the Good Shepherd. I am your host, Carrie Mecki Lozano. So today, the wise and talented and amazing Claire Paglia is back on the podcast. Her and I are kind of discussing this whole Montessori series that we have been doing throughout season 2, and we kind of wrap it all up, if you will, in the eyes of how does this all pertain to the spirituality of children, and how does it help us with freedom and discipline in the atrium and in our homes. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to all of those Montessori episodes, these are the ones that we are talking about. We had episode 48, History of Montessori with Carol Dittberner. Then Claire joined us for episode 49 on the 4 planes of development. Episode 50, Celine Mitchell spoke about sensitive periods. Episode 52, Sherry Mock taught us all things practical life. Episode 54, Kathy Yohani spoke about the human needs and tendencies. And episode 55, Carolyn Kohlhaus dove into the huge topic of cosmic education. Throughout this episode, you will be able to hear little bits of my 6-month-old daughter, Ramona, who decided that joining Claire and I in discussing all things Montessori was more important than her nap. So I hope you enjoy her contributions. Maybe she'll be a catechist one day, or a Montessori guide, or lead us all closer to the Good Shepherd. So this kind of ends this specific series on Montessori that we are doing, but there are so many different topics within the Montessori philosophy that as we keep moving forward with the podcast, we will keep diving into different aspects of it. I really hope you've enjoyed this series as much as I have, and I hope you enjoyed this episode with Claire and I. Claire, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, just in case anybody has not listened to the past episodes that you have joined us, Claire, would you briefly tell us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. So I am a child of the atrium. I was in the atrium from age 4 all the way up through level 3. The church kind of built it as I grew. My mom was part of that too. So a huge piece of that. So as an adult though, I'm Montessori trained. So I did my primary training and I finished that in 2008, I think, and have spent time as a primary guide for the last 12 years. And I've also been doing my level 1, a catechist in a level 1 atrium, since 2012. And so that's been a real gift to be able to do that as an adult now as well. And currently I'm working at home and also homeschooling my children and trying to be present and keep things as balanced as possible. It's always a trick.
Yes, that's always the challenge.
Yes.
Okay, so what Claire and I would like to do in this episode is kind of quote unquote wrap up our Montessori series, but it won't really be wrapping up because we just continue to talk about this. But we would like to kind of look back on the episodes that we've been doing here in season 2 on Montessori and gather all that information into one, if we can. Just kind of look at it in our hand and reflect on it and ask ourselves, okay, what does this mean? What does this mean for us, especially in regards to the spiritual growth of children? Also in regards to freedom and discipline. So Claire, I thought it would be good as we begin this conversation to revisit what is freedom and discipline.
Sure. That's a great idea. So I think as we talked about in that first podcast, I think it was almost a year ago.
Yeah, I think it was about a year ago.
Yeah. About freedom and discipline is that this topic is definitely one of the most commonly misconstrued, I think. I think it's hard for people to see that balance and also to be able to find that balance of following the child and also being a sturdy leader. I think that that's a really tricky combination sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about freedom, we think about kind of necessary freedoms in the atrium, like the freedom to choose an activity, the freedom to choose where they're going to work on it, the freedom to express themselves, the freedom to work alone or in a group, and also the freedom to move, because we know that movement is cohesive with life. So we want to give space for that. And discipline is, instead of kind of the traditional sense of discipline as the practice of training people to obey rules, it's more helping the child to develop self-discipline. So that the ability to control feelings, regulate in a reasonably age-appropriate way,
Right.
because that adjusts over time, to be able to really pursue what they think is right, and despite temptations to kind of abandon it. So really just to continue to really be able to follow the Holy Spirit too. I mean, that's a huge, huge piece of that.
Right. More of a discipline that is freely chosen.
Yes, rather than imposed.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's now look back at the different themes that we've hit up in these past couple months and look at them in light of the spiritual growth of children and freedom and discipline. So, of course, we had that beautiful episode where we dove into the history of Maria Montessori.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh my goodness.
That one was amazing.
She's a powerhouse. I don't know how she did it all.
Yeah. And Maria Montessori, there were things that I had never heard before. And I think just because of even just Carol's path in history, like she was able to experience a lot of those things firsthand and really learn a lot of those things firsthand. I don't know. It was really incredible to listen to, though. And Maria Montessori, I really don't know how she kept up with that pace. She kept a pretty fast clip her whole life.
Seriously, like there was no slowing down. Like I was particularly amazed with the speed that once it's like she saw the children and what they were capable of and started working with children. And then within a few years, it was all over the world. Like there were all these houses. It's amazing how fast, like there's a confidence that she had. It was like, oh, I know that I've discovered something amazing. And boom, I'm going to share it with the world.
And there was no internet at that time. Like, I mean, just thinking about how fast things can spread now because of the internet and because of our access to connect with each other. And during Montessori's life, like, obviously that wasn't an option. And even travel, I think, wasn't. It's amazing how much international travel she also did during that time frame, because that was a new thing too, to be able to travel like that. But just the people that she encountered in her life, it's remarkable. It is remarkable. Really revolutionary.
I imagine her walking around life with an open hand. Like it was like she was taking whatever God was giving her and observing it and growing from it. Like there was never like ooh, I don't want that. Like her time in India, like and how she ended up being there for like 7 years rather than just going for a formation. She took it and then it became this huge time of growth for her. It's a really beautiful testimony, and it makes me think like, oh my gosh, I have all these years left that I can accomplish things, because she was like 70 and still writing books and doing amazing things.
Yes, and even some of her last courses too, international courses. It's amazing, and she even wasn't deterred by the political environment. She wasn't deterred by the war that was happening. Like she just kept on. She's like, if I can't do it here, I will go there. That's just the way we'll do it.
Yeah, she was pretty amazing. I loved that was our beginning, because it kind of made everything else make sense, at least historically. It was like, okay, so that's when she talked about cosmic education or whatever. Yes. So that was a neat platform for the whole series. Then you came on our podcast and we talked about the 4 planes of development. And I love having you on the podcast. I think it's really great. But I loved this. I love the 4 planes of development, and I think it's so helpful for us, especially in regards to freedom and discipline, because it helps us understand who this child is that's sitting in front of us. Like you were talking about that second plane child and how they might be considered rude or a little untidy, and they're really brutally honest. And you said that it helps you have joy more with that age child to understand that they're not being rude. It's just who that child is in that plane. It's almost like if I can know to expect it and know that it's normal, then it's less personal maybe.
Yes. I think it takes the edge off a little bit.
Yeah.
If you're like, okay, second plane child.
Yeah, that's normal.
This
Like, it's
is
almost like
normal.
when you encounter another family who have just as wild children as you do, and you're like, oh, my friend, like you're like, great, it's not
Yeah.
just my children. There's like a comfort there
Mm-hmm.
that's like, okay, it's not personal anymore that my child is brutally honest.
Right. Exactly. Because it's not, I don't think that the child means it in a disrespectful way. And I think a lot of adults take it that way. But I think when we can really just see like, okay, they're just really, really honest, or they
Yes.
really, really want to know the answer to that, they're going to be as direct as possible.
Yes. Yes.
I think that's huge. And it definitely helps us as the adults to relax a little bit. I mean, I find that in myself. I can my shoulders relax a little bit. I'm like, okay. Kind of take a deep breath and go for it.
So understanding those different characteristics of these different planes of development, I think it helps us to be able to know why a child is behaving a certain way. It's typical for their age. Or also for us to be able to meet their needs a little bit better within that plane of development. Like, for instance, the first plane child and how much, especially that 3 to 6, how much movement they need. So expecting a 5-year-old to sit down and learn about Jesus might not necessarily be the best format and environment for them.
Mm-hmm. And it made me think of this quote, and I think it's from The Child in the Church. I'm going to have to look it up exactly where it's from. But Maria Montessori said that there is no space too sacred for the child. And I just felt like, okay, she knows obviously and acknowledges the planes of development. She acknowledges the sensitive periods. She acknowledges all of those different things, but she knows that even spaces that adults deem as sacred are not too sacred for the child, because the child is so close to the heart of God. I just think that quote came back up for me when I was, re-listening to the podcast. And I thought, I just think that that's a theme for us, is to really think about, it's okay for them to be there. It's okay for them to move. It's okay for them to talk. We can allow reasonable space and obviously have conversations and build in, I know we'll get to practical life in a little bit, but build in some of that grace and courtesy of what are the expectations when we're in this space. It doesn't mean it's a free for all. We can still have that freedom within limits, but all spaces can welcome the child.
And Celine talked about it a little bit in that next episode on sensitive periods. She said something like, Jesus calls the child to come to me, but we tell the child, sit, don't move, be still, be quiet, don't laugh. That's not the child. And both sensitive periods and planes of development speak so beautifully into that when we understand who the child is, we can allow the child who actually is the child to come to Jesus, not our version of what we wish the child to be.
Yes. And I think it allows us to trust in the child too. I think Celine mentioned that as well, just how much it can allow us to have that faith in the child and know that really this is okay.
Another thing with planes of development that we spoke about that I think is important to reiterate, especially in regards to freedom and discipline, is the idea that a child can start moving into the next plane in some ways, but not all.
Yes.
And so those kind of kids that are on the cusp of moving to a different plane, they have different needs. Like they might have different social needs or different physical needs, etc., that we need to meet in order for them to be able to have proper freedom and discipline.
Definitely. And I think too, with that, it's trying to find that balance of, even if they might start dipping their toes into the next plane of development, it doesn't mean we have to push them into the next environment. We can still meet those needs, maybe in a more advanced way in the environment that they're in. I know often in my primary environment, and even in the atrium at church, we try to offer for those older ones, like, here's some extra responsibilities that you can have. You can show this child how to do this. Maybe you can go across the hall and get, if we need an extra altar cloth, like you can go get that next, they can have those responsibilities and still, because they're not all the way in that plane of development yet, but they're heading that direction. So you can just start to add to the responsibilities and maybe expand the freedom a little bit just to be able to meet those needs.
Right. So Celine, in sensitive period episode, she spoke about those special times, those windows of opportunity when a child is particularly interested in maybe learning about something very specific or growing in a specific area in their life, such as a sensitive period for reading or letters or words or speaking, or a sensitive period for movement. And one thing that she said that I felt was particularly important for in regards to freedom and discipline is the idea that if a child is not interested,
Mm-hmm.
they're like, if they're not in a sensitive period for something, they're not going to be interested in it, and then they probably are not going to use that material correctly.
Yes.
The whole concept of freedom and discipline gets off whenever
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to maybe push our agenda onto a child who's not interested in what we are trying to push on them. They're not in that sensitive period for what we want them to be doing.
Right. I think that's definitely a place where observation is huge. And I think sometimes when we want to, we're like, oh, we need to check that box. We feel like we need to check that
Right.
box of that material going to that child, but the timing just isn't quite right. And sometimes it's because of a sensitive period, and sometimes it's just because of interest. Like they're just not that into it. And so either taking it a different angle or shelving it, tabling it for
Right.
later
Mm-hmm.
can help too. I think a big thing about sensitive periods that I did not know years ago when I was doing my Montessori training is that there's even disagreement in the Montessori world about what is considered a sensitive period, which
Mm.
is was like eye opening to me, because I had some of my friends have lists of like 7 to 10 sensitive periods, and in my training there were 4 that she really mainly focused on.
Interesting.
But I'm not sure what that is, unless if maybe the Montessori training itself kind of covers those other sensitive periods in different ways. Maybe that's another. But the 4 that were mentioned in mine were order, language, movement, and refinement of the senses.
Okay, so I guess that's something I'm learning then, because I kind of assumed that a sensitive period was anything, but you're saying that there are specific themes or specific
Yes.
sensitive periods, that there's a limit
It kind
to.
of like puts an umbrella, if that makes sense. So like with
Yeah,
language, like there's a whole spectrum of things that happen with that. Like they acquire language, then it can also
right.
like feed into the work that they're doing when they start to be interested in letters and reading. It all kind of goes on
So
this
it's not a
continuum.
sensitive period for reading necessarily. It's a sensitive period for language that's kind of manifesting within reading, being interested in reading.
Yes. Yeah. I
Okay.
think that there's also then more specific times that the children tend to be ready for letters and ready for, but it's more of a readiness thing instead of a sensitive period thing. But I think the other piece of this that was brought up to me recently, again, is just this idea that there are ages that kind of go with each
Mm-hmm.
sensitive period. But of course, we work with children. We're an inclusive environment, so we work with children that are neurotypical and non-neurotypical. And so I think just understanding that sensitive periods, those ages are a general guideline and a framework, but they're not a hard and fast rule. So you can have, children kind of do those things in their own developmental timeline.
Right.
Um,
Right. There's like an average age,
yes.
but it's not limited to
Exactly.
that.
Yes. Yeah, it's not limited. And it doesn't mean that, because that interest may arise later for a child that's developing on their own timeline. And that is, I mean, they all develop on their own timelines, just it's a little bit more observable than others, and that's okay. So,
The other thing that Celine spoke about that I felt would be very helpful for freedom and discipline is that the importance of the environment in regard to sensitive period. And she
yes.
talked about cutting, and that if a child is very interested in cutting and there's nothing for them to cut, then they're going to go cut something. So, in order for us to
Yes.
create an environment that matches the sensitive period, which then goes right back to observation, we need to be observing these children in our
Hmm.
homes or in our atria so that we are aware of their sensitive periods to make sure that the environment, which we are responsible for, that is our work, matches their needs at that time.
Hmm. I think that's definitely where the idea of follow the child, which is another one of those huge misconceptions,
Right.
is that it's not this, just like with freedom and discipline, it's not a free for all.
Right.
It's like you observe that interest in paper cutting, like, okay, how can I meet this interest? How can I meet this need? And because I was seeing this with my 2-year-old, she would find scissors and she'd get them in her hands. She'd be like, scissors. I'm like, yeah, you have them. So you're interested in learning how to use those. So then I made a little thing for her to be able to clip pieces of cardstock, but she was going to find the scissors even if I put them away. So it's
Right.
it's just
Right.
kind of funny how they do that. But again, like our observation, you can see that interest. You can say, okay, now I can make that material for this child. This child is telling me they're ready for it. Sometimes we can catch it ahead of time, and sometimes we catch it on the spot, and that's fine. So
Yeah. So then we went into Sherry Mock spoke about practical life, which is funny because at first I was not thinking that practical life would be able to connect with freedom and discipline very well. But then as Sherry spoke so beautifully, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so helpful for freedom and discipline.
yes, 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 definitely.
Like even just the idea that she spoke about of setting the child up for success. So like how we have preliminary activities that help a child then be able to do other activities. It sets a child up for success and for self-confidence that makes for the best environment for freedom and discipline. And whenever we kind of skip steps, there's frustration, there's misuse. That doesn't help with a successful freedom and discipline environment. But I think sometimes as adults, we forget these small steps that a child needs in order to be able to do a certain activity, like pouring or cutting or even like the grace and courtesy.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think I love how she really focused on how all of this really makes real work possible. You know, it helps the child be part of the community, and whether it's being part of community by understanding the grace and courtesy, you know, the social norms that are expected, or if it's being able to participate by setting the table or, you know, washing a dish or polishing their shoes, whatever it might be. Just being able to have a meaningful contribution to the community is huge. And it's not busy work. I think I love that she highlighted that it's not contrived, it's not pretend, it's not busy work. Like this is real work with real materials that are sized appropriately for the child.
Right.
So those are really important things, and it's vital for our environment.
Yeah.
And I think Sherry highlighted just how all creation has special gifts, and kind of when we're giving them space to contribute and be part of the community, we're allowing them to share their gifts with us, which is really big.
Yeah, Sherry's amazing.
I think Kathy Yohani was next with the human tendencies and needs.
Yes.
And I learned so much from her.
Me too.
Oh my goodness. Even though in my training that was the very first theory lecture we heard was on human needs and tendencies. And it just didn't sink in the same way as it did when I heard it this time. It was really amazing. And to highlight on Dr. Montessori's work in anthropology too, because I think so much of the time that's kind of pushed to the side, and we focus on how she was a scientist and a doctor and, you know, how she worked with children. But the fact, I think her background in anthropology really definitely informed all of the work that she's doing, and how she noticed those cross-cultural similarities and differences. I think she mentioned something about how there's no set numbers of human tendencies, and I thought that was really interesting, because I think that there's definitely the ones that she listed out are the main ones that we focus on, but I thought it was interesting to think about that there's really no set numbers. I was like, wow, that really opens it up.
Yeah.
But how these tendencies are so dynamic and they're interrelated, and so it can really help us, like on a spiritual level, like how we can continue to meet those needs. And even just looking at what Kathy was talking about with geography and orientation, I thought that was so fascinating.
Yeah, that was really fascinating. I've never thought of geography that way. But it was really interesting how she talked about that if you're having disruptions in your class or in your atrium, to check yourself as the adult in the atrium, and also check the environment to see if there's some human tendencies that are lacking. So this knowledge of human tendencies is so important for understanding why maybe a child is misbehaving.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think that's really key. And I loved that she brought up that quote. I think it was from Mario Montessori about how education should lead us to trust in the wisdom of God. And I think the next part of that was in the wisdom of the child too. I mean, just how those connect.
Mm-hmm. And she said many times that to work with those human tendencies and instead of to stifle them. So to be
Yes.
very aware of what you are doing to make sure that it is conducive with these natural things that are going on inside the children.
Yeah, working with what's natural. And I think Montessori also talks a lot about how we're trying to remove obstacles for the child. You know, we're trying to help that water flow a little bit more freely. And I think if you kind of think about, if you're working with it, you're going with that flow and helping, you know, the child grow more naturally and meet those needs in a more natural way instead of having it be contrived or forced.
Yeah, that was fascinating. That was human needs and tendencies. That was one area that I feel like I knew the absolute least about in regards to these different Montessori theories. And she did such a beautiful job of educating us. And she's an anthropologist as well, which I thought was really cool.
Yes. No, that was perfect. It was a perfect combination.
Yes, it was.
Amazing. I loved it.
So, and then the last one we just did was with Carolyn Colehouse, and she spoke about cosmic education, which is like, I feel like cosmic education is one of those themes that you just have to sit with for a really long time because it's everywhere, it's huge, it's interconnected, it's big. It's a big one.
It really is. And you know, for the longest time I felt like cosmic meant that it was chaotic. And so to hear her say, no, cosmic means order and unity. You know, you're really, it's this like large scale framework or map that it's all connecting. It doesn't, you know, and I think you actually brought up this connection to nature and just how much that, you know, God is telling us this story with the seasons and the seeds and the rhythms, and just what a beautiful message that is, but how it all relates to cosmic education. And actually the other day, a friend of mine we were talking about the difference between cosmic education and the cosmic task. And I thought that was, you know, cosmic education is really looking at developmental needs and how we're meeting those needs. But then the task is more of an individual thing, and how every living thing has a role to play. And really, what is your purpose is huge. It's so huge. So I'm amazed that you guys got it into one podcast.
Yeah, I feel like it almost needs another one to really do it justice. But I love what you just said, the difference between cosmic education and task, because I think understanding that helps us to understand that second plane child and some of their deepest needs that they need. They want to know what their place is in the world, especially that level 3, that 9 to 12-year-old child. Where am I in all of this? What do I have to do? What do I have to contribute? Where is my place?
Yes. And I think Carolyn was also talking about just how all people are part of the plan of God. And I thought that was another, I love the ways that the atrium, the work in the atrium continues to help the child connect to their cosmic task. Really, where do I fit in all of this? And it really draws on that interest from the child too.
Yeah.
It's really a really beautiful place to make those connections and discoveries.
And probably one of the few places in their lives where they are being asked that question.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'm so grateful that we did this whole series because I think it's really important for us to understand these Montessori theories, because I think it's easy for us, especially those who have done anything in a traditional education setting, for us to get caught up in, oh, the children need to see this. The children need to be presented this. We need this material, etc. And when we sit with these theories, we start to respect the child more. We start to respect this work more, and also respect the Holy Spirit as that primary teacher, and not us needing to control anything. There's just like a deeper freedom that comes
Yes.
with understanding these theories.
Yes, I agree.
So, yeah, I'm really grateful that these different women came on the podcast to help us to understand them a little bit more, because I feel like we just scratched the surface. And even me listening to the episodes multiple times, I got something different out of it each time. And it helps you to have freedom as a catechist with these
Mm-hmm.
children. It helps you to respect the Holy Spirit that's inside of them and not needing to control it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I found a quote from Gianna in Listening to God with Children. And it's the chapter about the child's work and cosmic work. But she points out that the work of the adult is often so exhausting and burdensome and kind of different from how impassioned the child can be. And I think her exact quote was that the child has this inner drive to work because it's through the work that the child builds him or herself while using and developing his or her primary instruments, which are the hand and intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And the child works not so much in order to learn as to become. And that really, thinking about this whole series and this idea of really helping children recognize and discover their cosmic task is it's a gift that we can give to them if we allow the space for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's huge. If we allowed the space for it. One thing I feel like in all of the different episodes that I kept hearing was that it's really the adult that has to change, to form. I think especially whenever we're like freedom and discipline, like these kids are not acting the way that I thought they would act, etc. How do I fix them? What I heard in all of these episodes was we have to look back at ourselves. We need to ask ourselves questions like, am I allowing for all of human needs and tendencies to be there? Am I allowing for this child's specific needs and their sensitive periods, or the growth that they're having at this time, or for who this child is that's in front of me? Am I allowing or creating the proper environment for that? Or, like there's more of an internal look at us first. And there's probably like 20 questions at least that we should ask ourselves first when there is a problem in the atrium.
Yes.
Before we actually look at the child and think that there's a problem there.
Yeah, there's a triangle I don't know if it's, well, I'll have to see if I can find one that we can send, but it's at each point of the triangle, there's a part that's one's for the child, one's the adult, and one's the environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so then there's arrows that kind of go in between each one, showing the interconnected relationships. So how the adult prepares the environment and the adult connects the child to the environment. The child works with the adult and the child works with the materials in the environment. And then the environment obviously provides for both the adult and the child. But really focusing on how we as the adults are the dynamic link for the child to the environment. We bring that material, that environment, that atrium to life. And I think it's a big task, but it's also something we are absolutely capable of, especially when we're guided by the Holy Spirit in the work that we're doing.
Yeah, I think it can create a beautiful spiritual growth within ourselves if done correctly. Last year in our episode together on freedom and discipline, you said something about having to check yourself at the door. And, of course, that's the physical aspect. But then I think even deeper, there's a spiritual aspect. Like, where am I emotionally right now? Where am I mentally right now? Where am I spiritually right now as I walk into this atrium in order to help be that connection between the child and the environment, the child and God? And I think a lot of times the issues that we do find in the atrium start there with us checking ourselves. We did an episode right at the beginning of the podcast 2 years ago with Diane Olson on the adult and the environment. And she spoke about this beautifully. And if I remember correctly, she spoke about some issues she was having in the atrium, and she brought it back to her, and she ended up praying for each child by name as a way of preparation for the atrium. And what a difference that it created whenever she was praying for them, but also whenever I think she allowed the child to be where the child was.
Yes. I think when we give thought and a little bit of focus to what helps us to center, we can be more present for the child. So whether it's arriving early and taking some time to pray for each individual child while we're checking the environment and making sure things are stocked, those little things, it's such a small, it feels small, but it has such a big impact when we are present. Then that space and time in the atrium is so much more peaceful. And I think we're then ready for whatever might happen, because we know every Sunday is different. So
yeah, I agree. I think that those little prayers, but it makes a big difference. And I like to walk around the atrium and call the Holy Spirit into this place. Just another small thing that we can do is prayer. Or I remember my friend Gabriela Perez spoke about how she would light a candle as she prepared the environment as a prayer, that as her work to prepare was her prayer, and also to remind her of the depth of what is happening in this space of the child encountering God. And yeah, I think that all of those little things do make a difference for the child, but I think they make a huge difference inside of us to be a better instrument, if you will, in the child's connections with God. At least that's what I heard throughout this whole series. Maybe that's just where I am in my life at the moment, but I felt like it kept pointing back to me of, I need to learn more about this child. I need to work on my observation of the child. I need to respect the child and where they're at this time, or to adapt the environment for this child, etc., in order for us to have that peace that we're searching for, and that the peace the child is searching for.
Definitely. And I think another small piece to this is that our goal is, we're not seeking perfection. We're just seeking, the concept of good enough is still tricky for me. I'm still, I feel like I'm a recovering perfectionist. So, but that we're really looking for just making the conditions as positive as possible for the child. How can we, and I think that's obviously, if we're preparing ourselves and preparing the environment, that's how we're doing that. But we're not trying to make it so perfect that, nobody can step in. We still want it to be a comfortable space that's really good enough for everyone.
Right. Perfection doesn't allow for vulnerability. So
exactly.
Yeah. Well, man, these are some big topics. I am going to put in the show notes a bunch of different links, because there's so many different ways that you can learn more. But I grew a lot after listening to the episodes again by reading the articles in our most recent journal.
Oh, yes.
The 2021 journal, number 36, because it's all things Montessori. And so I felt for me that was an easy way for me to dive deeper into Montessori's theories and philosophies to help us serve the child better.
That's an awesome one.
Yeah, it was really good. It is really good. And I want to do an episode on observation, because I feel like that's the next step as the adults preparing us, is to really grow in the art of observation.
I agree. I think observation and cultivating wonder sometimes can go, they can go hand in hand with each other, but observation is so key to all pieces of our work.
Yes.
That's really important.
Well, Claire, do you want to tell everybody where they can find you before we finish?
Sure. I am on Instagram, and I have a page called At Home with Montessori, and the main focus is our Montessori work at home, but sometimes I put in some things about catechesis too. So it's all a work in progress, though. That's for sure.
Is life. Well, thank you, Claire. Thank you for joining us again.
Sure. I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast. If you know anybody who might benefit from this podcast to help them grow in their work with catechesis of the Good Shepherd, or maybe to expose them to it, or with the religious potential of children, please share this podcast with them. I am putting a quote from Maria Montessori into our show notes that I found really profound and helped me a lot as I was preparing for today's episode. So go check it out. This podcast is sponsored by the United States Association of Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. If you would like to know more about Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, or if you would like to become a member, please go to cgsusa.org. Thank you all for listening this week. We will see you in 2 weeks. Go and fall more deeply in love with God.